Welcome everyone to What's Halvening, a weekly podcast bringing you Bitcoin mining and mining-related content. I'm your host, Cassie Clifton, and thanks for joining me today. Once again, I wanted to give a quick little shout out to Bitcoin 2020 before we dive into today's show. When you go to any conference, it should be equal parts high-quality content that gets your wheels spinning and equal parts high-quality conversations among attendees. But the best conferences are also fun and highly interactive. Bitcoin 2020 is all of the above. It's Bitcoiners serving Bitcoiners to bring them together in both fun and impactful ways to continue fueling this revolution. Whether you're looking to meet your fellow peers from the mining community or learn more about new developments in Lightning or Bitcoin sidechains, there's something for everyone. It's also priced to be one of the most accessible and affordable Bitcoin events in the space so that anyone can participate. Tickets are only $200 until February, and if you haven't bought your ticket yet, you can pay Bitcoin for $50 off, or if you're trying to hodl your sats, you can use my discount code CAST20 for 20% off at checkout. You'll find the code and a link to the event website in the show notes. And back to our interview here. So I've got some true innovators here with me today, Pavel Moravec and Čapek, who co-founded Braiins back in 2013 together. Braiins is the exclusive operator of SlushPool. SlushPool, which dates back to 2010, is considered both the first and the oldest pool in existence. For those of you who don't know the origin story of Braiins, Pavel and Jan discuss how they got connected, as well as dive into experiences that led them to take over Slush's reins from the pool's original founder and prepared them to scale it into what it is today. Pavel and Jan share the belief that just as Bitcoin is a transparent open source project, Bitcoin mining should be also. In an effort to address the issues of transparency, standardization, efficiency, and security across the Bitcoin mining stack, Braiins launched the first open source Bitcoin mining project, Braiins OS, in September of 2018. Today, you'll hear how Braiins OS, or BOS, originated, the progress they've made on this open source firmware project, and what this new level of transparency enables by giving the miners full access to their hardware. We also discuss their efforts towards greater efficiency and transparency at the protocol level with the implementation and features of Stratum V2. I really enjoyed this one, and I hope you do too. So let's go ahead and dive on into it. Pavel, Jan, how are y'all doing today?
We're pretty good.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah, great.
Good to hear. Good to hear. So, Christian was telling me that you had your holiday party this week. That sounds like that it was a lot of fun. Yeah.
It was, but it was a little intensive, I would say.
Was that was last night, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like nearing the end of the day there for you. So I'm sure that you're. Yeah, it's Friday, and hopefully you'll be able to get some good rest this weekend. Do you have any fun plans for the holidays?
Mostly with the family.
With the family?
Oh,
yeah, likewise.
Leave tomorrow morning for skiing.
Oh, that's exciting.
Last chance before the actual Christmas. So it's last second decision, and really looking forward to get outside of city.
Well, that's exciting. I definitely get that. Sometimes it's nice to just kind of get away from civilization for a little bit and be outside and out and about. So the last time that I saw you guys, we were in Chengdu at Miner Summit, and you guys had this really, really awesome after party. And I have to ask, because I heard different stories from multiple people, did you have beer imported there, or did you just find a bar in Chengdu that already had Czech beer?
No, it was a random coincidence that we found a place serving Czech beer. And once we saw it, it was an immediate thing that we have to make some party there.
But we were trying to convince people that we actually did the full import and everything, like a joke.
Okay,
but
I think that's the story
right
that
away.
I heard,
There was a special bar. Yeah.
I was like, that had to be really expensive for an after party, especially with how fast people were going through that.
Yeah, we were thinking like, what's so special about us coming from the Czech? And we were thinking beer is the note that we should really try to communicate that we are about the beer. It's a cultural thing. So
definitely like an icon of Czech culture. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I remember you guys were really, really excited to see the pandas. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to go. But did you enjoy seeing the pandas?
Well, it was my first time seeing it
really?
live, so yeah.
Oh, that's so exciting. Yeah, I think we'd even gotten into a random discussion about how, you might be considering a panda logo for SlushPool.
No, if somebody said this, it had to be a joke.
No, certainly. Yeah, no, I'm just playing. All right, well, let's go ahead and dive in. I know that both of you come from software backgrounds, but I'd love to kind of hear about like your experience working towards creating the first mining pool and how you two met.
So I will try to start, and Pavel would cover the other part of the story. We've met sometime around 2005-06 when I graduated from university, and we basically met in my first job. It was actually an unfortunate job because we were working on mainframe computers, so it was like a big disappointment for a graduate from a university where you're used to using like modern tools, and then you're pretty much back to the punch cards, even though they're like on your terminal. So that was like a half-year experience, and both of us found out that this is not where we would like to spend our careers. And that's also where our career started, because I was a lot into embedded Linux and operating systems. So I started working for a company called Cisco who did embedded Linux, and I started consulting. So maybe Pavel can cover up the beginnings again from his perspective, and then we can continue from there.
Yeah, sure thing.
Yes, as Jan mentioned, we departed a bit, and I focused more on like larger systems, mainly in finance. I spent even some time with discrete optimization, things like scheduling crews and stuff like that, with, again, in some larger systems. And after after being hired to run a software development team for one company, I called Jan if he would like to join us, because I wanted to build a good team, and I knew from past experience that Jan is a great engineer. So we joined forces again for an employer, and then we decided that we don't want to work for anybody else anymore. So we created a company together, and since then we are having Braiins systems together.
Maybe I can continue from here. So the company initially was doing actually embedded software. So for jet sets, basically writing firmware for controlling engines and stuff like that, because it was close to what I was doing. And we actually had a project that would pay off for the development. So we started that. And sometime around 2013, we got involved with the pool where Marek, or Slush, who started the project, was already tired from running the pool himself, because it was just one-man show. It was a small garage project, basically nothing that you can call like a professional grade thing, but it was an invention at that time. So he wanted to move on and started working on Trezor, and he needed somebody who would be trusted and reliable. And since Pavel is Marek's friend and schoolmate from childhood, pretty much, he just decided to work with us. And we basically built or scaled the pool to today's dimensions, and turned it into a professional project exclusively operated by Braiins. Pavel, can you add anything?
No, I think you covered it pretty nicely. We spent years and years together with Marek during our younger years, before he went to college to different city than I went. So we had a lot of years together. So it was pretty easy call for me to get into the Bitcoin, and so I was introduced to Bitcoin through Marek.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, when you're starting a business with someone that you've been friends with and like vetted in a sense of like you've worked beside them and know what their strengths are and their skill set and their experiences and background, I feel like it's very, very easy to work together and be super dedicated in what you're doing.
Yeah, it is even funnier because right now we are having more and more people from our past. We have two guys who I was working for in one of my jobs before. So my boss from one of the companies is right now part of our company. Again, because we have a long years of experience working together, knowing each other. So yeah, what you're saying is completely right. Once you have this experience, it's invaluable, basically.
Absolutely. I am curious to know how long after SlushPool's existence did the next mining pool come into existence?
I think it was pretty shortly. It's a tough question because we were not involved with the pool at the very beginning. So I would assume that the first pools were probably sometimes 2010 already or 2011. Pavel, maybe.
My guess would be months.
Yeah, it was followed because the concept was discussed in a Bitcoin Talk forum. So people knew the concept, and SlushPool happened to be the first, incepting the concept and trying that it actually works. But I'm sure there have been multiple parties already working on something very similar.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I feel like with having that discussion there, and then kind of like seeing the first, actual proof of that project, and like putting it in, like taking it from theory into practice, and like seeing how that worked, and then what the opportunities are there. I'm sure that a lot of people were very eager to hop on that train and be one of the earlier movers and shakers of the pool space. So of course, before we dive into creating Stratum V2 and the Braiins OS software or firmware, I think that we have to have a better understanding of really what the motivations were behind both of those. And we can't do that without talking about ASICBoost and amp bleed. So, right, naturally, I'm sure this is a part of all of these conversations. So I think that background story, though, is so important, because it's like really the aha moment for at least anyone I've spoken to who hears this story, for like why this is so necessary for the space. So I'd love to just hear about your experiences with ASICBoost, and we'll start with ASICBoost.
Okay, I can try covering the fairy tale behind this. Somewhere around 2017, we have been actually working on a firmware or testing a firmware at that time for Dragonman's T1s, and the business deal didn't work very well. And we actually had a firmware written for a piece of hardware that was not popular at the time. So we were thinking, okay, let's have a look at what's the most popular firmware and what can we do with it. What is the most popular hardware in the industry, which were the S9s at that time. And we actually converted this piece of software into eventually Braiins OS. With a primary support for S9s. And we were interested, like, what is the deal with ASICBoost on S9s? Like, people have been talking about it. You could read like stories in Bitcoin Talk forum about that. And basically everybody was like failing to have it working. But there were some rumors that some people are able to get it running. So we really started investigating what the cause is. And we found out that the factory firmware as it is actually capable of doing it on an S9, but the problem is that the results that are coming out of the machine are garbage from Bitcoin protocol perspective. They were generating invalid block headers. I was like, okay, so how difficult would this be to fix this and have support in Braiins OS for ASICBoost right away? And we found out that the basic obstacle was that a huge piece of software logic is actually encoded into something that they call FPGA. It's a component on the processor, on the control board of the miner, that does some pre-processing of the work that is actually sent to the physical mining chips. And the logic in this was broken. I don't want to say it was intentional or not intentional. So we were trying to figure out like how to get this fixed, and the only way how to fix it was, because specifically this part is difficult to reverse engineer, or you can do it very easily. It was more simple to actually write it from scratch. But at the same time, we published a report on medium.com about our findings, about the analysis, basically claiming that if Bitmain actually fixes the firmware and this component, we can reuse it right away for Braiins OS, and we would have support for ASICBoost from day one. But I think the most annoying thing about the whole ASICBoost story is that you, as a user or owner of physical machine, you were not allowed to use all its features, which I think is very annoying. Basically, it would just make you waste about 10 or 13% of electrical energy. Some people confuse ASICBoost with something that you're actually gaining extra hashes. in a way, this can be done, but the primary thing is with ASICBoost is that you're saving energy because the chips are not using all the circuitry, which can be deactivated and not consuming the energy. And then you can use your energy budget to actually overclock your device, and then you're getting more hashes. Does that answer your question? Maybe Pavel has more insight because I'm maybe too technical in this.
No, I think that was a great explanation. And Pavel, I definitely want to jump to you. But just to kind of like add to that with some of the conversations I've had in the space, I think what you say there is so spot on in terms of like you buy this equipment and it's not yours. And that was something I didn't really truly understand until I had a couple of conversations with miners in the space. And that overclocking is really important. And you know, the idea that some of the miners that I've spoken to, they're like, you purchase this hardware, it's now yours, but you can't modify any of its factory settings. And then they go into hiring hackers to override their firmware. I think what you said, Jan, at Bitcoin 2019 last year, if you don't own your keys, it's not your Bitcoin. If you don't own your firmware, it's not your miner. Yeah,
that's something that we believe in. I mean, considering that the whole Bitcoin space is fully transparent and open source, it's kind of weird that the mining part, which is actually in a way, it's the most important thing because it's actually securing the blockchain, doesn't have this transparency, which I would assume may represent a certain level of security risk. What can happen if somebody can exploit some global bug or even a backdoor and shutting down the hash rate? I don't know. I mean, now we already have multiple manufacturers, so the probability is not that high, but they kind of keep going in the same steps as Bitmain did. So if you look at What's Miner or others, they don't provide that transparency, and they're trying to hide it behind the fact saying, oh, users are not experienced and we want to prevent them damaging the equipment. So we're actually protecting them by not giving them the full access to the device.
Yeah, there is one aspect related to openness of the firmware or the device. And it is, for me personally, I don't think it is necessary that the vendor provides open source firmware, because you can always prefer to have, for example, better functioning software, but it's paid, whatever. It can be useful. But the problem is if the miners don't have an access to the device so that they can use their own firmware, the firmware of their selection on the device. And so locking the actual physical miner and preventing users to flash their own audited firmware or selected firmware, that's the main problem. We can see already in the space paid firmwares doing some tuning, for example, and it's perfectly fine if the miner has the capability of choosing, okay, I will use this firmware or that firmware, or I will use open source Braiins OS. The choice is the critical thing, not necessarily the openness of the firmware, because there can be open alternatives.
I think the choice is just having a choice that exists rather than being forced into like a singular option is a theme throughout Bitcoin. And you see that in with privacy as a choice as well. But it's another side tangent.
Yeah, exactly. You can use custodian exchange, no problem. But you are doing it based on your decision, and this is exactly what you said. The option of changing things, it's a core value.
Maybe just again two a little bit technical comments on the accessibility of the provided hardware that is currently in the market. The manufacturers don't seem to get this, and they really, even firmwares that they were providing originally for S9s, the newer updates actually lock you out, so you cannot log into the miner anymore, and you can just use it from the outside by the API and by the web interface, but you can't just do any changes. And lately they also added like signature checking. So the firmware image, so trivial fix to this is that, okay, I take Braiins OS and I upload it through the website of the miner and upgrade it to firmware that I like. But what they did, they actually added the signing which prevents you from uploading the firmware, which from software perspective is okay. I mean, any Linux distribution, any Windows system, whatever downloads any updates, makes sure that it downloads updates that are signed and are authentic. But at the same time, as an owner of the device, you should always have the option, and in this case, you don't have it. You always have to find some exploits. There are groups on Telegram that are actually exchanging information how to exploit the current firmwares for end miners so that they can actually upload the firmware that they like. So this is the problem. We also have this protection in Braiins OS, so we don't allow, when you do upgrade of Braiins OS, we check the signature of the image, but it's for protection against viruses. But if the user decides, I don't like Braiins OS anymore, they want to wipe it out and replace it with factory firmware, they are free to do it, because you always have the option to log in and or whatever, use some mechanism. So these are like different approaches, and they're trying to hide the intention to cut you off by saying, okay, we're actually protecting you, which is not truth.
Right. And like in a world that we're like in trying to create this decentralized world, and like what Satoshi's original vision was, is that the miner has the authority. So the miner should have the authority for that authentication on that level and in that choice. And I think that that's super important. And I've definitely read a lot into like in the forums of people complaining about not being able to upload firmware of their choosing onto their hardware, and then complaining and like not truly understanding like what the main issue was, is that on the manufacturing level that they weren't being allowed to do that. But similar case with like your private keys, like you have authority over your keys, and only when you grant someone else authority to do that. But the miners didn't necessarily grant that; they had no option.
An analogy of this would be an exchange that would not allow you to actually leave the exchange with your coins. Saying, yes, okay, just use our wallet and that's all you can do. You can sell the coins, you can deposit cash, but you just can't move your coins to your own hardware wallet. That's kind of an analogy.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a better way to phrase it. So before we dive into Braiins OS, because I know you guys have a lot of exciting things going on over there and a lot of milestones that you've been hitting. When we talk about getting into the firmware and like your idea and your vision is creating an industry standard in mining software across the whole stack. And that really started with Stratum V2. So ASICBoost being part of the motivation there, and also Antbleed, I believe, right?
I can speak to the Antbleed adventure. That was and Antbleed was for us another, I would say, motivation or confirmation that the path that we decided to take was developing an open source firmware as a baseline for miners who want the transparency is a good decision. So I wouldn't say that Antbleed would be anyhow related to Stratum V2. The motivations for Stratum V2 were, from our perspective, mostly technical and based on security concerns and efficiency.
Gotcha.
And stuff like that.
But so just to like give people a better understanding, if you were to, I know that you've been collecting lots of information and feedback from like on the various software stacks that are available as a large part of like building out your roadmap and designing a lot of the features. I'd be curious to know what some of like the larger inefficiencies that have been cited by mining farms are, even outside of the authentication layer for firmware.
The first obvious thing is the amount of data you need to transfer from pool to miners and back during the mining process. It is like completely outrageous inefficiency right now using text-based data, and that if you imagine that there is, for example, 500,000 connections to a pool, pumping data in and out every single moment, because mining is online thing. You always need to exchange information. Then you can imagine that the scale of inefficiency can be really high. So this was the first thing we it was triggered by the amounts of data and some other like implied inefficiencies. Once you have to send a lot of information, it takes you more time. So the timings are worse than if you don't have to send this large amount of data. There are assumptions about how mining works in V1, or how to say it in general terms. Everybody knows that once in 4 years, the halving happens and the block reward is halved. And people assume that transactions will pay or will give you more value, like transaction fees will proportionally be more valuable than block rewards in time. But the original mining protocol was not taking into account the fact that everybody needs to work on blocks full of transactions from the 0 second moment. So what's happening right now is you can see empty blocks mined once in a while. And Stratum V2 even tries to solve this, looking forward looking into the future towards a moment when it's critical to mine always full blocks. It's great for Bitcoin in general, like having full blocks means pumping transactions or confirming more transactions. But even from mining perspective, it's more efficient if you always mine full block.
I was just going to ask, how is it that you're solving for this problem?
Multiple things, but the most neat trick what the Stratum V2 does is it allows you to communicate future blocks to the miner before it is needed. So what you can do as a pool, you can analyze basically mempool. You know that miners are preferring more transactions with higher fee and smaller transactions because they can get the most value out of mining these transactions. So you can analyze the mempool, guess what transactions will be mined in the next block, and use other transactions to prepare a next block. And you can communicate through V2 to miners this template of a new block even before the currently finding block is actually found. So once the block is found, you can easily distribute the information. Hey guys, start mining on this already prepared full block. This is the core trick. There are some optimizations allowing these things to be done efficiently, but this is the core thing.
So now we're kind of getting into the conversation of work selection, which I know was a large part of Stratum V2. And I know BetterHash played a large role in helping to conceptualize what Stratum V2 would be, right?
Yeah, you're very well informed.
Yeah. Before we dive into that, I would like to help explain a little bit better the process of work selection. And I know you kind of just went into that. But so as a pool, what you guys are creating with Stratum is that the pool is no longer responsible for selecting the block template, right? Which would enable the miners to select it on their own. What does that process look like? And then what happens if the miner's block template that they've selected is invalid?
Oh yeah, it's a tricky situation because you as a pool operator, you would like to get or give the users, the miners, the free choice of transactions. But at the same time, you're validating the work, and based on the work, you're paying the miners for their work. But so you have to be sure that the work is valid. It would create a valid block accepted by the network. So what we did is just a protocol for the miner and pool to exchange the actual content of the block, what is the miner mining on, but in an asynchronous manner, so that the miner can start to mine on the block immediately. And within a couple of seconds, they can exchange enough information to double check that the work would be really valid. And if the miner is not cheating and actually building proper blocks, it's 100% efficient. But if a pool can detect that the miner is working on an invalid block, you can basically do some kind of punishing the miner by taking some money back or things like that. But in the cooperative scenario, there is the whole thing can be 100% efficient.
Yeah, that's interesting. So in like a very simple broken down version, more or less, the miners themselves now have the ability to choose the block template. And at the same time that they would begin hashing, you're verifying those block templates so that they make sure that it is a valid block template. And then from there, they like that is in their hands, right?
Yeah, there are like two different versions of verifying work. One is only checking that the hashes are correct, and this can be done very fast. There's almost no information needed to exchange. So the pool can double check the hashes from second 0. And after that, the full block template checking occurs. And the critical thing, this is a simple idea. It is not a rocket science. The difficult part was how to make this scalable in a larger setup.
Right, I can imagine.
And running 100,000 machines, not every single machine can exchange information about full block. You would be DDoSed by your customers if you're trying to do it naively. So the complexities are how to make it so efficient that everybody can use the feature and still not kill the pool.
Right. That was what was most ambiguous to me, was understanding how all of them are able to be verified so quickly in that given time frame.
You cannot do that. What you need to do is typically set up a proxy who would negotiate the work for all the machines, which can be connected to the pool, to different nodes of the pool independently, but they can reuse the negotiated work on their mining connections. And this allows for much higher scalability. There is even a concept of having a third party, which you as a miner would trust that they create the proper blocks and they don't censor transactions and so on. And you can be fed these negotiated block templates from a third party and use it for mining on a pool. So there is a lot of scenarios like this, helping to not negotiate like 100,000 blocks, because it doesn't make sense, obviously.
Right. So out of curiosity, what are some reasons that, aside from like an invalid transaction, obviously, what are some other reasons that you might see an invalid block template that would be selected?
Invalid version field, you name it, any field in the block header that is not compliant with the current protocol is considered invalid. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah,
double spending.
And time, for example, there are strict rules what the fields should look like, what values are valid or not. You can reorder transactions. You can put in any invalid transaction, double spend, referencing transaction which is later in a block or things like that. There's a huge amount of things what can be wrong, especially if somebody tries to build some custom block. A lot of things can go wrong.
So I'm curious to know, so this is not required by the miner. It's an opt-in, right? An opt-in feature?
It's an opt-in feature that the miner can use, and the pool has to provide it. So if there are pools that don't implement this feature, then you can't just force the pool with your own block templates unless the pool offers this job negotiation channel.
Right. And currently you are the only ones doing so.
Not even us yet, because we didn't implement the whole stack yet. It is pretty complicated thing. We're definitely working on that. But the decision to make it optional was really deliberate, because as we discussed the complexity of scaling this approach, it means the implementation is not necessarily easy. And we wanted to allow people to use all the nice features of V2 even before pools implement this most complex job selection part of the whole thing. Because like not having it optional would seriously harm the adoption.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious to know, like you mentioned, that it's very, very complex, and especially in the earliest stages of this implementation of this potential opt-in feature, what additional work would be required on behalf of the miners? I know like theoretically what it would be, but like in terms of more of like a time commitment for doing so, like what do they need to know in order to like if they wanted to partake in this feature and opt in for it?
For miners, it's not a complicated thing, but they would have to run their like proxy server, negotiating the work. We would provide it once we have it implemented, or anybody else, any other pool which would provide this feature. I'm sure will even provide a necessary software package for the miners to use it. The miner then have to run their Bitcoin D node, and not a lot more things. I think the complexity is mostly on the pool side, which is again kind of deliberate, because the pools have the incentive to provide better services to miners, so they should spend the effort providing the service and not offload it to miners. So from miners' perspective, I don't see a barrier. It's more an infrastructure problem for pools.
Interesting. And have you seen much? I mean, I know that obviously it's still in beta, but have you seen much demand for this, or like a strong interest in the community?
So far, we have been questioned about this a couple times, but overall, this is really meant as a sort of a security measure that we have the option in the protocol to do something like this, unlike the previous version of the mining protocol, which just didn't have this option.
Right, like putting the authority back in the hands of the miner themselves.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
On the long run, when the block reward goes even further down after halving, miners may come up with interesting business cases where they would actually need the work selection, but still having the convenience of sharing the variance or reducing the variance through the pool service, so that they don't want to mine solo. So these miners could actually push and force the pools to implement it, because they would need it to cover their business case. But it's not happening yet, because everything is really in early stages, and we should really make sure that the concepts and things that are in the protocol are correct.
Yeah, well, it needs to be clear that it is, we think, pretty well designed. We tried our best, tried to do our best, but there is not a full running implementation. So there is still non-zero chance that we missed some critical flaw. This is even the reason why we really appreciate other people's feedback and looking into the intricate details of the protocol before we try to ship it. Yeah, so we'll see. I think it's mostly going in a good direction, and the feedback was pretty positive so far. Even with some external suggestions. So it's cool to hear like positive feedback from other people, especially from mining industry.
Yeah, it's definitely very exciting that that people are excited about this feature and it's just its existence. It's definitely needed because, I mean, even if it isn't something to fear in this very moment, we aren't sure what the future holds. So I think that being prepared for that and having this option is really critical for the space.
Yeah, I agree.
So that was kind of the question about on that specific feature of Stratum V2. But what about on the manufacturing level? Do you think that they would adopt this protocol?
Well, initially, the first step that I would see, or we would see, is that you could adapt the existing firmwares just by using or deploying a local Stratum proxy that would do the translation from V1 to V2, and having an alternative in the form of Braiins OS. Eventually, the big mining farms could start pushing on the manufacturers that they really want the support from in the stock firmware for the protocol. But overall, there's no need to really rush or anything, because there are ways how to use the protocol already without switching the firmware completely to V2. We actually support V2 from day one in the new VOS miner, but we can speak about this later. And the reason is that we want to make sure that the protocol is actually functional and doesn't have any flaws. And you cannot just write a draft of a protocol at your desk and believing it works. So we have been using the protocol for quite a while, and all the changes, or a lot of the changes in the actual mining part, have been motivated by actually having the hands-on experience with having a code actually implementing the protocol on the server side and on the mining firmware side.
Yeah, implementing a draft and having millions of miners globally implement a protocol that's more or less still in beta version is probably a pretty large security risk. Just in terms of we're not sure exactly how that would go. So I think it's very smart to take the time there and really beta test it on your own before shipping it. So I would also like to get a little bit better of an understanding, and I know we've touched on a couple of these, but on the firmware side, what is it specifically that you're so excited for about the Braiins OS firmware compared to the other firmwares that miners are currently using? I know you've mentioned authentication and greater data efficiencies, but what are some of the other really exciting features?
I don't know if Pavel mentioned this, but the mining protocol has a native support for version rolling, and what that really means is that it has header-only mining, where the work done by the miner doesn't include that they have to build their own Merkle root. This is a technical thing, but it's an actual computation that they have to do in order to prepare work that they can work on. And the problem with this approach is that it's very suitable for big farms where you are running one proxy and distributing the work across a lot of miners. Basically, the current mining protocol has quite a bit of computational demand on the server side, because when the miner submits a result, the server has to reconstruct the original work that the miner was actually trying to work on, and then eventually it can verify the result if it's correct or not. And we tried addressing this in the new mining protocol, that there's an alternative way which we call header-only mining, where we literally send only the Bitcoin header to the miner, and the miner is rolling its nonce in the hardware, and it's rolling the version field, which is another field in the header, which extends its search space for the solution. And when the miner finds a solution, when it sends it back to the server only redoes the SHA-256 computation to verify that it matches the target, but doesn't have to mess with the Merkle tree and build the whole Merkle root again. So what that means is that the server would be faster able to evaluate if the result is correct, and with new blocks being found in the network and so on, this is an efficiency thing.
And that's probably also in a similar manner as to how you can solve for the header by hand in binary. This is also just purely in binary, right? You don't need any other source code for this.
I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but the protocol itself is binary. But where are you really headed with the question? I'm not sure what you really mean.
Yeah, more or less, I'm just asking is for the previous version that wasn't the header-only version of mining, was that purely in binary, or was it also in another language?
Oh, I see. The data format used for the old protocol was JSON, so it's basically text saying here is this field and so on, and it has some extra data overhead. Whereas it's easier if a machine talks to other machine, exchanging data in binary format, where the machine pretty much maps whatever you send to it and doesn't have to do a difficult translation from text to binary, so that it can work on the data that has been exchanged to the protocol. So this is the other efficiency change in the protocol.
Okay, interesting. I would also be curious to know, so that was one of the aspects that you mentioned of like greater efficiencies. I'd also be curious to know like what type of compatibility this will have for mining tools or management software on that side.
Well, the protocol is designed from scratch. It is designed with some compatibility features in a way that a miner always asks for a certain version or range of versions of the protocol that he's able to work with, and the pool responds the overlap of the version that it actually supports. So the protocol itself now includes a feature where we count on future upgrades. Another part of the protocol is that we allow we want to support custom extensions, but not custom extensions the way they're done in the old protocol, where somebody just figures out, okay, I'm going to add this message and now my pool supports whatever, changing externals one. But this should be done in a controlled way, where you would register the extension with stratumprotocol.org that we have set up, so that people would know. And we also have reserved some range of identifiers for extensions that would be like private or local or vendor specific, where you don't have to tell anybody. It's kind of like the private IP range that you have in your office. Like there are many IP ranges that are the same, but since they're not like routed, so publicly distributed information about these private networks, everybody can like share the same numbers without interfering with each other anyways. So this is the idea behind tracking the extension identifiers.
Yeah, but the cool thing which is baked into the protocol is the intermediate node, for example, a proxy or a pool, doesn't have to understand all the extensions, because it is done in a way that the software can recognize, hey, this is a message as part of an extension. I don't know the extension, but there are rules set up so that you can either just transparently send it upstream or ignore it completely, but you don't have to understand the extensions, which really improves the whole space, because you can be sure that your software can run even in environment when some custom extensions are in place, and things like that. It's just
that's really exciting, and I feel like that's like moving forward leaps and bounds for UX and UI, and being able to add an extension without having to fully like understand what's going on and read through it and know what it provides you. So that's really cool.
Yeah, it should help with getting better information from the miners. It can be hardware specific. It should help with managing the machines as well in the long run. There is a lot of potential by using properly described extensions. Obviously, not everything will happen in 1 month, but we try to set up a protocol which will last again for years and years. So these are more future capabilities than things used from day zero.
And it's kind of like anything that's open source and being developed, like Bitcoin's development took time. And in a similar way, like getting people to submit these extensions and review them is going to take some time. So, but that's very exciting.
Yeah, but problem is that once you release the core protocol out there, and if there will be machines using it, then it's really difficult to change it after the fact. So we need to nail the core protocol pretty much on the first try, and these extensions can follow. So whatever doesn't have to be in the core protocol, we want to keep it for extensions, because then you can throw away an extension and provide a different one, or it's much easier to manage these changes after getting the experience. But the core thing I assume it will not change for a lot of years because it's so difficult to get people to upgrade to completely new stack. So
certainly, and with extensions too, it's like you have the protocol, but then you have the optionality for miners to more or less create a turnkey solution based on their own needs, without having to fully implement all of them if they didn't need one or didn't want one. So that's very cool.
Yeah, you should not need any extension for mining. All aspects of mining and on various use cases needed by large miners, big, small miners, it should be covered by the core protocol. The extensions are meant mainly for data collection, remote controlling, and some interesting use cases built on top of the mining itself.
So have you already begun to have some extensions submitted?
No, but
no,
we are
okay. It's not set up yet. I was
about
curious.
A few of them, yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, I was going to ask what some examples might be of ones that had been submitted and what they enabled, but yeah, if that hasn't started then.
The obvious use case, like from day zero, is you want as much information from the miner as possible to actually understand what's happening. You can see temperatures, blah, blah, blah. The bigger farm you are, the more information you want to optimize all the stuff, because whenever you can save some money because of cooling or whatever, it can help you. So data gathering would be use case number one, I think.
Is that something that you're working with Chris at CoinShares and Apolline at Cambridge on, just in terms of what the data gathering strategy and analysis might look like on that?
We do, but it is a different kind of data gathering as what we are typically Cambridge is not really, they don't want to know temperatures of cores on the mining devices. But it is a nice coincidence. We are in discussions with them about providing information from pool about where our miners are geographically located to help research on green versus not green energy in Bitcoin mining. But it is a different kind of data.
Sure. I was just thinking as, they kind of grow their operations that they might be curious to expand into some sort of manufacturing overview and getting a better understanding of whether or not the manufacturer qualities that they, whatever is claimed as their capabilities, how close they are experimentally as they are theoretically in the lab. But
yeah, it's a cool area. The more data we can get from the machines, the better analysis of these sorts of things will be happening. And I would be really curious about seeing this kind of data processed and analyzed properly.
Yeah, I definitely would as well. I back in college did a lot of those types of experiments on mechanical equipment, and I was always pretty astounded to find how off the manufacturer's data often was. So it was usually very far off, and sometimes you were just 30%. That seems like a lot, plus or minus 5% is what they quote me at, but that's not right. So yeah, I would be curious to know. In general, I know that obviously this feature on Stratum is geared at the potential of further decentralizing the space should the miner opt in to do so. But in more generally, what other aspects of mining centralization do you believe pose the greatest threat to Bitcoin? Which one should we be most concerned about today and trying to solve, though obviously not all of them are solvable today?
I think I have already mentioned this in SF, but there's quite a few people out there that believe that current centralization problem is in the manufacturing, where we see already changes in the industry, but we still have basically single players in the game being able to produce the ASICs. So this would, from my perspective, this would be an area that should be addressed on the long run. But we shouldn't be very naive about this, because this is a business. So once there's enough incentive to enter the business, and if it's super simple, which is not the case, and that actually proves by the fact that we don't have that many parties trying to successfully manufacture mining hardware. But when you look at the list of companies somewhere on Wikipedia that ever tried manufacturing mining hardware, it's real long, and most of them are already bankrupt. So this would be an area where I would see potential threat. And like geographically, when you look where the companies are coming from, it's mostly China. So we can, be a little bit suspicious about the future of this setup. But I mean, this is how it is.
I think it is even some perspective on centralization is not covered mostly, I think. And it is, we should talk about who controls the hash rate, because that's the core thing. What you don't want to happen is somebody having so strong influence that they can do whatever they want with the hash rate, attacking the network. That's the thing we try to prevent by decentralization. So the core thing is who controls the hash rate. And it historically, it was a lot of manufacturers running their own operations and having deals with the miners that they have to obey, let's say. But in the long run, it can be strong financial groups running a lot of different farms. So it can be geographically spread. It can be made from a lot of different kinds of hardware. And still, it can be just a group having their hands on a lot of hash rate. And this is the most critical thing to decentralize. But it is at the same time very difficult to say who is running the show and who is behind the scenes. So
yeah, go ahead. I don't want to interrupt.
No, I would be curious to see who the owners or controlling persons are, because it's not publicly available.
Likewise, I've been doing some research recently and putting a couple of pieces of information together across the last 6 months, and it's a little concerning, though. There isn't any strong evidence to really support this more or less I guess idea or assumption at this point. But we saw in the last 6 months, 90% increase in hash rate, right? And then Chris with his report came out and said estimated 70% of that was in China, right? So there was a lot of new, really efficient equipment going out on the market. You see Bitmain's S17s sold out in 3 days. That's wild. And I know that there are pre-orders, but then there's also the thought of there, VIP, a lot of the, at least from what I've seen, new operations aren't necessarily in China. The ones that are growing and have a need for equipment. And then you see the potential for those in China who have a really, really strong relationship, potentially being the first to have access to those machines. So it's definitely some questions to raise there, just in terms of who has that hash rate. Is that probably more likely than not, it's definitely not any single player, but was it largely one player? So that's just, I think, something that we should be questioning and thinking about.
Maybe a side note that we have been noticing while visiting China is that already some miners are considering their operation in China to be a little bit risky for them, so they try to diversify and actually move their operation out of China, at least part of it or significant part of it. So because the question with the political stability is always something that they're trying to consider. So it's interesting that they're already thinking in this way. So we could see actually some of the Chinese hash rate being sent to the US or other parts of the world where they feel it's more safe for them.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a need to hedge against geopolitical risk in this space. Whether or not you're in China or the US, I think that should be something that you're thinking about, whether or not it's operations in various US states or one in US and one in Canada. Just kind of thinking along those lines and looking toward the future rather than the short-term 1-year outlook I feel like a lot of operations have taken in the past. But it's interesting to think, I know too that there are several manufacturers who've considered coming to North America, especially with tariffs currently and the trade war. But it would be interesting to see, like, in some ways, that's definitely a good thing because it's slightly more decentralized, but at the same time, is it really more decentralized if it's still the same manufacturer just operating in a different territory? So that's something that's, I think, good to think about, but I don't really know who would be coming into the space. But at least I think that if we did have a new player come into on the manufacturing side, they would at least have the advantage of not having to go through like all those massive steps in innovation that led us to basically where the current, non-endemic chip industry is today in terms of like being on par with iPhone or tablets and whatnot.
The only problem that I would see is that even if you have the money, the transfer of the technology knowledge, it's an IP, intellectual property, that nobody wants to give for free. So if you think about it, like people say, if you want to build a 7-nanometer foundry for the most modern chip, it's $4 billion. The question is, if you have $4 billion, would you find a company, speaking of the major players that are able to, run this technology, would there be anybody willing to sell you the technology and build the facility for you? I'm kind of doubtful about this because I think we're really at a stage where the technology itself matters more than, and the knowledge, the technology knowledge matters more than the money itself. So that's, I don't think a newcomer to the industry, he can take some shortcuts because a lot of things have been published and some things are already known from the designs and stuff like that. But at the same time, there are like little things that would never get transferred to you, and that is the competitive advantage that the existing manufacturers would still have. But I still see another aspect. Maybe the hardware itself being produced by a few parties is not the biggest issue. I think the biggest issue is what is really running inside of the hardware as a software, where when the ecosystem or the industry matures enough, and I know it's already happening, it may really like demand from the manufacturers that they just want the bare metal, and the miner who is purchasing a batch of miners may, for example, really demand that they want a custom firmware that they have an image of, or they would refresh it. So once the miners gain again the control over their miners, things may not look that bad in terms of some potential threat or whatever. If there was some government backdoor in the stock firmware of a Chinese manufacturer, so you could pretty much scratch out all these conspiracy theories.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. When you think about it, like there's only so much that the form factor can really contribute to improving and seeing greater efficiencies. But what it really comes down to is like how what software is enabling the hardware components to interact and communicate with the mining pools of the server, the protocol. So I think that's spot on. Did either of you have anything that you wanted to close with? Anything that you wanted to announce or anything that's coming up?
We have updated our Braiins OS with an alpha of a new mining software. People sometimes confuse the components of the project. Braiins OS itself is the operating system, but it has been using CG Miner or its clones for the actual mining. And we came to a point where it was for us unbearable to maintain this software because it was not possible to expand it. The code base itself, throughout all the years that has been changed by the manufacturers, is really messy. So we decided to rewrite this from scratch. And I think yesterday we have published an SD card image for an S9, which already has a Braiins OS running the new mining software. It is not production ready. It's sort of like a developer preview, but it already has the basic features like hashing on all hash boards, fan control, temperature control, small API, and stuff like that. So we're moving towards replacing the CG miner completely in Braiins OS in a short time.
Yeah, I saw that. I think that's really exciting. I was speaking to a company several weeks ago, and they were having a hacker come in so that they could access and override the OEM fan controls and whatnot. So I think that's really exciting, and and people will definitely be checking that out. You guys, SlushPool has an anniversary coming up. Is that right?
Yeah.
10 years. Is it not?
10 years in.
Yeah, it's ages.
Ages, yeah. Well, that's very exciting. Are you guys doing anything to celebrate?
Oh, good question. I didn't think about it yet, but we should.
You definitely should.
Yeah. We should do something
Get
crazy.
active on social media.
We were so busy the last weeks. So at least me, I didn't think about it at all. So it's a good reminder to start to prepare something.
Yeah, definitely something to think about. But I'm sure that, after last night's party and the last couple of weeks, it's probably pretty tough to think about partying. It's funny, like towards the end of the year, like no matter where you are in life, whether you're working or whether you're in school and you have exams, you feel like you're always like racing towards the end of the year. And then like the break comes, the holiday break, and you just like want to sleep and like rest, and then you have to go right back into it. So
I have it differently. I mean, I'm looking forward to the holidays so that I can work without an interruption. There is a lot of people in the office, there's a lot of things going on. But during the calm holiday time, you can just do things which are impossible to do when the rush is. So it's still working time, but on a completely different level. So I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, definitely a more intense level of focus and ability to kind of like let your wheels spin and wander off and whatnot, instead of having to be super, hyper focused at whatever is at hand.
Yeah, you said it exactly.
Awesome. Well, Pavel and Jan, thank you so much for joining me. I know that you guys have had a super busy holiday break, so time leading up to the holidays. So I hope you have a really good holiday break. Where can we find each of you in Braiins on social media, on Twitter?
We have a SlushPool handle. My Twitter handle is Braiins. If you're interested in SlushPool, just go to slushpool.com. If you're interested in some open source stuff, just go to brainsos.org. That's about it. And we have an active Telegram group that deals with Braiins OS and it's like a support channel for the users. So any of these channels can be reached through.
Yeah, and I don't remember my Twitter handle.
Oh, no. Okay. Well, that's no worries there, because I will put all of these and links to those sites in the episode description. So we'll be all caught up there. But you can find me on social media at BitcoinCast, and you can follow the show at What's Happening. And be sure to follow and subscribe to What's Happening and stay up to date on mining podcasts. Again, gentlemen, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today.
It was our pleasure.
Thanks to all my listeners out there for tuning in to today's episode of What's Happening. The What's Happening podcast is a BTC Media produced podcast on the Let's Talk Bitcoin network. It was produced and edited by Christian Corollas. You can find more podcasts covering Bitcoin on the Let's Talk Bitcoin network and can follow them on Twitter at the LTB network for all of the latest episodes. The following content is for informational purposes only. You should not construe any such information or other material as legal, tax, investment, financial, or other advice. Nothing contained in this presentation constitutes a solicitation, recommendation, endorsement, or offer by BTC Media, the Let's Talk Bitcoin network, or any third-party service provider to buy or sell any securities or other financial instruments.